Coach Peikon, thank you so much for your time. For the listeners at home, will you tell us a little bit about your background, your motivation, and kind of where you are currently?
Yeah, of course. First off, thank you for having me on. So my background, I come from the track and field world as a 800-meter athlete, and the way that I ended up in strength and conditioning was that, as I was transitioning out of being a full-time athlete in track and field, I was doing my formal education in biochem and molecular bio. And I was trying to apply everything I was learning in school to trying to take like a second crack at being an athlete and improving my performance and learning more things. And that naturally led into what I'm doing now, where it's kind of blending the science with the practice of coaching.
Okay. And so do you think that being an 800 runner and all that, do you think that's influenced just your mindset in any way right now, or how you approach things, or your approach to training?
Yeah, I think being an 800-meter runner was kind of what sparked my curiosity with dabbling into some of the science of training, I think. In the track and field world, most events have a pretty distinct body type that's associated with them. You look at a 100-meter sprinter, they're usually pretty big dudes, or pretty thick, carry a lot of muscle. Maybe you look at a 10K runner, they tend to be longer, thinner athletes. But when you're an 800-meter runner and you line up on that starting line, you look at the guy to your left and they're built like a 100-meter sprinter. You look at the guy on your right and they're built like a 2-mile or a 10K runner. And then you all just have at it and you end up getting similar times. You start thinking like, okay, this isn't really making that much sense if we have two dudes that look completely different, have completely different builds, oftentimes train in completely opposite ways, but they're producing the same types of results. So I think trying to understand that myself, like, what should I be doing if I'm training more similar to one of these guys and I'm not getting good results? Maybe I try things on the opposite side of the spectrum, and then you start seeing how individualizing training could really speed up your rate of progress quite a bit.
Okay. And then on that same or similar token, I guess, so how did you end up going more private sector route? And so, I mean, you can also kind of touch on the company that you're with a little bit versus like college or even like pros or anything like that.
Yes, I think that happened kind of authentically. So when I had finished my undergrad, I was starting a master's program. And while I was doing that, it was really research intensive. And quite honestly, I wasn't a huge fan of kind of lifestyle associated with that. I was doing a lot of coaching on the side just to make money and because it's something I enjoyed. And I had connected with my now boss, Max Elhag, who was a really well-known coach in the CrossFit world. He had worked with a lot of top games competitors, and I was really interested in learning from him because there weren't a lot of other people applying scientific principles or more classic strength and conditioning principles to the sport of CrossFit, which is where I kind of cut my teeth originally. So that led pretty naturally to me working for the company and then being in the private sector for the past 5 years now.
Okay, awesome. And then is this something, do you see yourself long-term in the similar setting, or do you see yourself more moving maybe back toward more of the track and field population, or what does that look like for you?
Yeah, so it's hard to say right now. When I first started here, I was working with really the majority of my clientele was CrossFit athletes, and I'd kind of worked up the chain from working with more recreational athletes and eventually working with more games and sanction level competitors. But in the past 2 years, I've started to branch out a little bit more, where now I'm like more of a 50-50 split between CrossFit athletes, and then the rest of my clientele tend to be people with like hybrid training goals. Maybe they want to compete in powerlifting and run an ultramarathon, or military personnel, so people who are just interested in concurrent training in general.
Okay, that's awesome, and that's a perfect segue, right? So let's dive a little bit into training. So one of the things that you're known for is integrating technology within your monitoring practices, right? So how are you able to effectively, and efficiently balance the use and integration of tech with, that very delicate art of coaching?
Man, that's the never-ending struggle.
Right.
So I think where I'm kind of at with that right now, and I've thought about this quite a bit recently. So one of the things that I always think about, we have the athlete, and ultimately they're the point of control. We're trying to change their physiology in some kind of meaningful way to produce an outcome. For me, when I first started dabbling in a lot of the sports science tech, I came into it with the thought that I was using it to try and enhance their performance as much as possible, but one of the things that I've started to realize over the past few years, particularly working with a lot of the higher level athletes, is that they don't really need tech to enhance them as much. What they need is for you to help them figure out to help them figure out how to not run themselves into the ground. So for me, for intermediate athletes it's different, but for elite athletes, I'm using sport science to prevent them from getting injured or ill. So it's taking a little bit more of a backseat. So the way that I blend that with more practical coaching is that for them, training load is going to be one of the biggest things that are going to impact injury and illness. And monitoring training load it's kind of subjective. Like when we're working with these concurrent training athletes and they're doing strength training, energy system training, movement training, sport work, it's hard to really quantify their volume. So for me, we have that athlete, we have training load is what we're trying to manipulate. And then what I use those monitoring technologies for is kind of like check engine lights. So if I'm popping a Moxie on this athlete every day and I'm getting baseline blood flow values and oxygen utilization values, I could use those trends over time to see how they're changing, and you could assess whether someone is accumulating significant muscle damage, and that's impacting motor unit improvement. You could use things like thermal imaging for that as well. And if I see those red flags, now I know I need to change their training load. But at this point, we don't have a technology that's sophisticated enough to tell us, like, okay, reduce their squat volume by 2 sets every week. 3 minutes less energy system training, so the tech just tells us generally what we have to do. Then it's up to us as coaches to make those decisions, and that's where the art comes in, because we're just not that sophisticated yet. We like to think we are, but...
No, I hear you. Okay, and you touched on the Moxie, right? So what other measures do you use, or pieces of technology do you use to monitor, like, load or anything, really?
So right now the Moxie is probably the big heavy hitter for me. That's the one that I probably spend the most time using. But other tools that I do use, I am a fan of Omega Wave. Maybe not using it for the training aspect, but more of a back-end monitoring load over time.
Naturally.
Recently I've been getting a lot more interested in using thermal imaging, so infrared thermography. So the thing that I'm most interested in right now is trying to combine that with Moxie or NIRS data to see if we could come up with a way of monitoring both acute and chronic training loads and seeing how it's impacting specific tissues in the body.
Okay, that's crazy. Okay, that sounds pretty intense. And so where does one even, like, get a piece of technology like that?
So right now, previously there were more companies selling NIRS devices, at least on kind of like a consumer level, but recently one of the big ones went out of business. So Moxie Monitor is probably the most common NIRS device that people use outside of a lab. And then for something like thermal imaging, probably the biggest company doing that right now is called Thermo Human, but there are other softwares and packages that people could use that might be cheaper, easier to get into.
Okay. And do you see this kind of technology becoming more of the norm in the next, like, 5-10 years, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think eventually, as the technology gets cheaper, I think right now that's kind of the biggest barrier to entry for most people, like outside of the private sector, getting into general population's hands. And I think the other thing that makes it difficult is just the learning curve on all these devices are so steep that, I mean, I think of even my coaching load a few years ago, where when you're coaching 20, 30 athletes, you're working with team sports, like you don't have time to
not at all,
spend doing, I mean, you know, the world is like, there's not a ton of time for continuing ed or investing in that tech, but once it gets cheaper, once it gets more accessible, I think that's going to usher in kind of a new wave of sports performance.
The field is ever changing. So to see where it goes, and even like a year or two is going to be like, wow, like, you know what I mean? Like, we didn't think we'd be doing some of the things we do now, where we are. And so, it's cool to see kind of the direction it's changing. It's also scary, but at the same time, I mean, change is always a little bit scary, right? So
of course.
Okay. So let's key in on some Moxie stuff, right? So how has using the Moxie kind of changed your program design, whether that's for, warm-up, ESD, or, just looking at micro versus macro cycles?
So the biggest thing that Moxie's changed for me, first off, when I first started using the device, it confused the hell out of me. Like, you read all these things in textbooks, and you're brought up with these things that are kind of hard facts. Well, one of the first things that happened when I popped a Moxie on, and I just messed around with it for a little bit, and I did a all-out sprint on the assault bike, and you start seeing as soon as you start sprinting, oxygen's depleting in the muscle. Once oxygen bottoms out, you're done. You can't produce any more force, and you're just trying to hang on.
Yeah.
And for me, that was a big light bulb moment, because I'm like, okay, I've read all these different exercise science books, I read all these different coaching books, and I was under the assumption that when you're sprinting, it's not a quote-unquote aerobic activity.
Yeah.
But when you dig into the literature, you realize, sprinting is very intimately tied to the aerobic system. If oxygen's depleted in the muscle, you're not producing power. So knowing that, it opened up a lot of different avenues for using this kind of technology, ranging from warm-up applications. You had mentioned energy system training, which is probably one of the more useful ways to use it. To me, the way that I explain the use of Moxie with conditioning work is instead of saying, okay, do a 400-meter run at this pace, rest this amount of time, and then repeat it X number of times, we write those workouts having some kind of preconceived notion of what we're trying to achieve with it or what adaptation we're going for. But on a given day, that workout might be a little bit too much load, or it might not be enough load. So we could use something like Moxie to adjust pacing and live time, interval length, and real-time rest periods. And then we could dial it in so we're getting the magnitude of stimulus that we want all the time without overstepping or understepping boundaries.
Okay, and so you talked about the sprinting part, right? So let's key in on that a little bit too. And so in the literature, right, and schooling, and typically, we're taught that that's going to be alactic, and that's going to be, kind of splitting ATP, and so oxygen is not going to be utilized as much, right? So will you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think the best place, if people are interested in this, I would start with the paper called the Glycogen Shunt Model by Shulman and Rothman. And really what this paper starts to introduce people to is more of a contemporary model of bioenergetics. So we have that old chart that's in like every coaching book that most people are familiar with. It's power on the y-axis, time on the x-axis, and it has from like 0 to 10 seconds. ATP PCR, then there's like 10 seconds to 30 seconds, etc. From 2 minutes onward, it's the oxidative aerobic system. That model's not inaccurate, but the reality is instead of that occurring over the course of seconds to minutes to hours, you could take that entire model and sandwich the entire thing within about 1,000 milliseconds. So all these energetic events are compartmentalized to an extent, but they're compartmentalized on the rate of milliseconds. So within a perceivable human second, all of these things have cycled through over and over and over again. So knowing this, knowing that oxygen and phosphocreatine stores are so tightly coupled to one another, we could use something like the Moxie to make inferences about what phosphocreatine is doing. If we see oxygen's going up on a Moxie, we know there's phosphocreatine being replenished in the muscle. If we see oxygen depleting, we know phosphocreatine is depleted as well. If there's no oxygen, there's no phosphocreatine. Now we're not replenishing ATP. So using oxygen as a proxy, we could get a really good understanding of the bioenergetics of the cell and within the muscle.
That makes a lot more sense then. When you kind of break it down that way in a term of like substrates, right, and replenishment versus it's just, again, it just seems contrary, right, like you were saying, to what a lot of people learn on surface level, right, and a lot of people only do learn surface level. So I think it's important to dive into some of that and look at the literature, right, and then again going back to training, right, what are your for example, if you're going ESD and power strength, right, you talked a little bit about it, but like how is that changed even more so in terms of time constraints and even exercises?
So the biggest thing for me with strength work, I'm sure you've seen some of these athletes who, you have some guys that they like look at a barbell and they just get stronger. And you have other guys and you put them through the ringer with like every classic strength protocol and just nothing happens. And one of the things that was really interesting for me is starting to monitor specifically blood flow trends in these athletes and seeing what the differences are. So are you familiar with, I'm not sure how much people use it in more of a classic strength and conditioning realm, but it was a big test in the CrossFit world. People called it like an NME test. they would take...
Sounds vaguely familiar, but I might just be making that up. So go ahead and tell us. Yeah.
Yeah, so what people would do, this is a big thing 5 or 6 years ago, they would take 85% of a 1-rep max back squat, and they would have someone perform it for max reps.
Oh, yeah,
Okay. I think Charles Poliquin might have been the one that came up with the test initially.
Okay.
And they would say if someone got 1 or 2 reps at 85%, they would say they're very high neuromuscular efficiency. If they got 15, 20 reps, they would be very low neuromuscular efficiency. And that's a really useful training concept because it gives you an idea of how you should train someone. If one athlete could do 2 reps at 85%, another one could do 15 reps.
Yeah.
Well, if you give them both 5x5 back squat at 85%, one of them is probably going to die.
Yeah.
The other one's going to be understimulated. But one of the things that I started seeing when I would have athletes perform this type of test with the Moxion is that the athletes that got 1 or 2 reps, they would be creating enough tension in the muscle to occlude arterial blood flow. So they're not getting blood into the muscle and blood's not escaping the muscle.
Yeah.
And the athletes that were getting a ton of reps, 15, 20, they were getting blood into the tissue. Oftentimes they would get a venous occlusion, which means blood's not escaping, but they were still getting blood and oxygen into the muscle. And that's why they could perform so many reps.
Okay.
So seeing this, I started to create connections between what would classically be considered strength work and what would classically be considered conditioning work. At the end of the day, it all just comes down to bioenergetics. So when we think about it in these contexts, we could do like load management tests with athletes. I might have someone they'll do some unloaded air squats, then put on an empty bar, and they'll build up in increments of their 1-rep max, and I'll find the percentage of their 1-rep max that they get muscular compression versus venous occlusion versus arterial occlusion. And that varies quite a bit between people. And then you could start to understand, oh, this athlete cuts off blood flow to their artery at 75%, and they're really good at adapting to strength work. This other athlete doesn't cut off blood flow to their artery until 95%, and they don't adapt well. So maybe it's because they can't produce enough tension in the muscle to restrict arterial inflow, and then you could start individualizing intensities that you're using to drive specific types of strength adaptations.
Okay. And so with this, right, my wheels are turning a little bit. And so say with this NME test, right, so I guess from a contemporary strength point, we would just kind of think, right, if you can do X amount of reps, like above, say like 6 for 85%, then could it be said that not a true 85%, or what are your thoughts there?
So that's something that I have thought about that quite a bit in the past, and if it was a less advanced athlete, I would be making the argument yes, but to give you perspective, I've seen athletes hitting upwards of 10 reps at 85%, and these are guys with cleans close to 400 pounds. So they're really experienced athletes. They have a great ability to express strength, and they're squatting close to 500 pounds for 1-rep max. So I think this is where CrossFit exposes some unique physiologies where you have athletes that are exceptionally strong, but they have amazing cardiac output. So your ability to get blood into the muscle is the relationship between cardiac output and muscle tension. So that's what allows these athletes to perform so many reps. When they lift at 85%, they create a given amount of tension in the muscle. But their heart's able to push through that tension and break the quote-unquote pressure blockage, and that's why they could perform so many reps.
Okay, so you would say for this NME test, you would see those numbers more on a CrossFit athlete versus like a general team sport athlete, right?
Yeah, generally with if you have a very strong team sport athlete, you generally don't see them hitting exceptionally high reps at 85% of their 1-rep max. But one thing that we do see in team sport athletes quite a bit, and it's kind of interesting, I work with a few guys that come from like soccer playing backgrounds, or football if we're international, and then they get into CrossFit. And one of the things that you see is these guys, when they start doing CrossFit, they put on muscle mass and strengthen their upper body really easily. And in their lower bodies, they have trouble gaining muscle mass and putting on strength. And when we map the percentages of their 1-rep max that they get these different compressive forces, they get them at much lower percentages of their 1-rep max in their upper body than lower body. Because if you think about it, they've been improving cardiac output and blood delivery to their lower body for 20 years, not their upper body. So the relationship between the heart and the working muscle is skewed between body regions.
Yeah. So that's trainability, I guess, right? Because that makes total sense. Okay. And so with that, right, kind of again pulling on that thread a little bit, have you been able to integrate Moxie in more of a team setting, or is that something that you guys are looking to do, or what is that like?
So for me, I don't personally work with as many team sport athletes.
Mm-hmm.
So I do consult with different teams, and it's something that we've tried to start implementing in their different sports. But one of the big barriers is less about the practicality of using Moxie with the players and more about players' willingness to have those technologies used. Like in the professional sport world, you'd think with all the resources at their disposal that it would be easy to apply sports science in some of those teams. But the thing is, you have the players' unions, and you need to get pieces of technology approved, and players are concerned with what's happening with their data and if that's going to impact their ability to get drafted to another team in future seasons. So I think that's the biggest hurdle versus the actual tech.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. And so with that, right, there's this zone that I think it's specific to Moxie where we, call it quote unquote survival training. So how do you balance like optimal performance with that survival training?
Yeah, so one of the things that makes Moxie unique with trying to do that, particularly with CrossFit athletes, you think about what their competition is, and it is trying to survive in a hypoxic state and performing pretty high volumes in that. So if we were to use something like Moxie, what makes it useful is that their sport's fixed. If they want to be a CrossFit athlete, you're going to have to put yourself through the ringer somewhat often.
Yeah.
But then on the other days, we could use Moxie to get more targeted adaptations. So if I want to do something that's going to improve an athlete's cardiac output on a Tuesday, maybe after they do some sport work on a Monday, I could use the Moxie to make sure we're stimulating what we want to stimulate, but we're not doing anything that's going to create additional compensation patterns. Then that allows us to just get in, get the work done, and get out before we start pushing too hard.
Yeah.
There are other ways to do that as well without Moxie because, to be honest, a lot of my clients don't have the technology.
Yeah.
So it's something that's informed how I coach, and then I take those principles and apply them with other athletes as well.
Yeah, I love it. Okay. And so, given that a lot of athletes are kind of respiratory limited, right? How have you kind of effectively been able to use respiration techniques within training?
Yeah, so when athletes present with respiratory limitations, there's a few different things that I think about. One, I always first look at their position. So a lot of times an athlete presents as being respiratory limited, and you put them through a not an orthopedic evaluation because I'm not a PT, but you can look at their posture, you can look at some of their joint positions and kind of the general position of their axial skeleton, and you'll see that they present with excessive thoracic extension. If you think about it, if you extend the thoracic spine, the diaphragm's not going to be able to expand vertically while the athlete's inspiring.
Yeah.
Then what's going to happen is the superficial neck muscles and the sternocleidomastoid, they're going to pull upwards on the clavicles to create vertical space for that diaphragm.
Yeah.
And in CrossFit athletes, that leads to a lot of pec, shoulder, neck injuries.
Yeah.
But in general, you're not going to be able to do a whole lot to strengthen the diaphragm if they're stuck in that position. So first thing for me, make sure they're in a proper position, get that squared away. If positionally everything checks out, then we can start looking at basic breathing mechanics. A lot of CrossFit athletes in particular, but it really happens in a lot of sports. People tend to breathe with their chest and with their traps. So first teaching athletes how to breathe diaphragmatically. Once you get that squared away, teaching them how to breathe into their rib cage to create 360-degree expansion.
Yeah.
Once all of those pieces are checked out, now we can start training the diaphragm, creating more fatigue resistance in it and creating more strength. So my go-tos for that, if we could get an athlete on something like a Spiro Tiger, that's like the gold standard. It makes it so easy to train the diaphragm without creating a lot of joint stress. That's not an option. We might use what we call like extended desaturation training intervals. Using the Moxie makes this easy. If we don't have it, we have to create proxy workouts to get similar data. But basically what we would do is have the athlete use a cyclical modality and pull oxygen down to as low as they can before it plateaus and hold that steady. And then once they start completely bottoming out oxygen in the muscle, or they can't reload oxygen back into the muscle during their rest periods, then we cut those sessions. So basically what they're doing is creating a scenario where there's ever increasing amounts of CO2 production. They're being forced to blow off that CO2 at faster and faster rates. And then when they can't do that, we shut the workout down, and that's a wrap for them.
Okay. And so with that, in the early stages of the breathing, and kind of correcting that breathing mechanics, for lack of a better term, do you guys integrate like PRI or anything like that, or?
Yeah, so we do use a lot of PRI-based principles. A lot of our positional breathing stuff is based off of that. One of the things that I do keep in mind, though, and I'm a huge PRI fan, but a lot of their research is mechanistic stuff, and it's just really hard to study these things. So while I do put stake in the principles they're using, that's not the only thing that I would use with an athlete.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay. And then you mentioned Spiral Tiger, right? So generally speaking, it sounds like you hold it in high regard, but what are your thoughts on that and accessibility to that?
Yeah, so first things first, accessibility on that is tough just because it is a little bit more of a pricey device. If someone is able to use something like a Spiral Tiger, I think it's fantastic, because what makes it unique is it monitors your depth of breath and your cycle of breathing to make sure you're balancing CO2 levels. A lot of respiratory training devices create imbalanced CO2 levels, so that's the main reason why I like the Spiral Tiger. But the other thing that it allows you to do is rebreathe your own CO2 and have different accommodating resistances on the back sides that you're using. So it's kind of like a barbell in a sense, because you could train strength of your diaphragm muscle with it. You could train muscular endurance with the diaphragm. You could train coordination in the same way that you could use a barbell to train absolute strength on a squat, muscular endurance, coordination, speed, strength, all these different qualities.
Okay. And so you said you could rebreathe your CO2. Will you kind of explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so a lot of the respiratory devices on the market, they don't have a ventilation bag, so you're breathing off all of your CO2 into the environment. When you're doing this at very high rates, you create what's called a hypocapnic state, so you're breathing off CO2 at too fast of a rate, and because you're not moving, what you end up doing is creating what's called a left shift in the oxygen dissociation curve, so you're at rest and you're breathing off all your CO2. Then what's going to happen is hemoglobin in your blood is going to bind oxygen more tightly, so you can't unload oxygen, and then that's going to create some different downstream effects. So it's something like a Spiral Tiger. Part of your CO2 is being released back into the environment, but it's also capturing some of your CO2 and you're breathing it back in. So then that way you're balancing the amount of oxygen and CO2 coming into the body, so you're not creating an issue where there's too much or too little CO2, because both of those can be problematic for different reasons.
Yeah, okay. And so within breathing techniques, right, I think it would be remiss if I didn't mention some Wim Hof breathing, right? And so what are your thoughts on that? Because that's going to be, right, you're going to be holding on to CO2 longer, and so you won't have the drive to breathe as much, correct?
Yeah, so with something like Wim Hof, it's one of those things that I think for some people it could be fantastic. For other people, it could really mess them up from a training standpoint. So the reason that I'm not personally a fan of Wim Hof is that the populations that I work with are generally high-intensity athletes, and that's really where those breathing protocols have caught on. You don't see it a lot in general populations. A lot of CrossFit athletes are doing that. So the good thing about Wim Hof is it improves someone's CO2 tolerance, which if you're a long, slow endurance athlete, like an ultramarathon, awesome adaptation. If you're kind of a sedentary person, you don't do a lot of high-intensity work, that's also going to be really beneficial for you. But CrossFit athletes are a population that, on average, they have really good CO2 tolerance already, and that's a product of the high-intensity work that they're doing consistently throughout the week. So if you take a CrossFit athlete who's CO2 tolerant, and you start layering in these Wim Hof breathing protocols every single day, what you do is you desensitize someone to CO2, and then you're going to create dysfunction in someone's respiratory drive. So instead of their brains signaling them to hyperventilate when there's CO2 building up inside their body during a workout, they won't be signaled to breathe properly, and they won't start to try and breathe off CO2 in a workout until they're getting peripheral oxygen desaturation. So their brain's literally losing oxygen. That's something that we could measure with a pulse oximeter.
Okay.
So that's pretty common in athletes that do those types of breathing interventions.
And so what, maybe a dumb question, but what is a pulse oximeter?
Yeah, so have you ever, at the doctor's office, they pop that little device in your finger that measures your pulse?
Yeah.
So what a Moxie monitor does is it penetrates the muscle and it's getting oxygen saturation in the capillary beds of your muscle.
Okay.
What a pulse oximeter is doing is it is more superficial, so it's getting oxygen saturation at the level of the artery.
Okay.
So that gives you an indication of how much oxygen your brain, your heart, your lungs are getting. Generally, people sit around 98 to 100% on that device. When you reach between 85 and 90%, you're going to black out.
Okay, gotcha.
And over the course of a workout, you don't want to see that change at all.
Yeah.
Those athletes that do a lot of the Wim Hof breathing and CrossFit, you'll see them get down to close to 90%, and a lot of them start reporting things like their fingers and toes going numb.
Yeah.
You'll see their lips start turning blue at the end of a workout.
Oh gosh, yeah. All right, okay.
It's pretty gnarly.
Okay. So what kind of recommendations do you have, or do you have any special recommendations for nutrition in terms of like what you see from the data?
Yeah, so I don't do a ton with nutrition directly. I have a handful of people that I'll refer out to for practical reasons. One, I just don't have a ton of time to invest in that, so I have general recommendations with quality, quantity, and things of that nature. Then also, honestly, for legal reasons,
for sure.
I want to stay away from giving too much nutrition advice.
Yeah. Okay. And so, moving forward a little bit, right? What recommendations would you have for someone who's trying to do something similar as you, or learn what you know? Because your depth of knowledge is great, and how does one even start to tap into some of that?
Yes, I think the biggest thing for me is a lot of it. Like, it sounds so cliche, but I think it's really just putting the time and effort into doing continuing education, whether that's taking courses. Personally, I've always been someone, I just like reading, so I think if someone wants to understand something like NIRS or understand some of the physiology, it's really as simple as breaking out a university level physiology book. Could start with like XPhys 101. Read the textbook cover to cover. If there's anything you don't understand, look it up. We all have Dr. Google to consult with, and then when someone has a base level understanding, they can start to figure out what it is they're interested in, and then just let their curiosity run with that. Start using something like PubMed, do the research on your own, and start to put these pieces together, and eventually something's going to stick, and you can start to understand what you're seeing in practice with your athletes or with the populations you're working with.
Okay. And so what are some specific resources that have had a big impact on you, right? You talk about books or courses. Are there any that really jump out to you?
Man, I've taken a lot of courses, and it's hard to pick one that's really had a huge impact on me, but I think honestly podcasts have been big for me. So I've listened to a bunch of the ones. I love the one that you did with Aaron Davis a while back.
Real
that's
smart.
someone who's had a big influence on me from a physiology standpoint.
Okay.
Researchers like George Brooks, their work has been really influential as well. So it's kind of a few different researchers in the field or different resources like that I've leaned on quite a bit. Okay.
And so moving into this last segment here, right, just a few questions, kind of more about you personally, right? So if you have any, what are some quotes that you live by?
Yeah, so one of the ones that I really like, particularly from like a work standpoint, it's a quote, I think the guy's name is George Box. It's all models are wrong, but some are useful. So one of the things that I always think about, anything that we're learning, like in the strength and conditioning world, like you said earlier, the field is going to change so much in the next 2 years. In the past 2 years, it's changed so much. So it's easy to think with like some of the things that we know right now. If you talk to a coach 20 years ago, their like head would spin with some of the information. It's easy to think that like, oh man, like we've got this stuff right. Like look how little they knew back then. But the reality is, in 20 years from now, people are going to be saying the same thing about all of these things that we're interested in. So it's remembering that the goal of science, the goal of coaching isn't to be right. It's just to be less wrong over time.
Yeah.
And the less wrong we could be, the better, but never trick ourselves into thinking we have any of these answers.
Okay. So what is the best advice you've ever been given?
Probably things along those lines, like understanding, like, you don't know anything. My dad's been a big one with that, just with kind of the process of education in school and from, like, a young age. I've always remembered he told me, like, anything you ever want to know, you can find in a book. So it's always been my go-to resource for trying to learn things, trying to understand the world, and then continually being on that path.
Okay, so in contrast to that, what's the worst advice you've ever been given?
And I feel like there's a lot more bad advice than good advice.
Okay, fair enough.
I think for me, like, a lot of the things that I've always been interested in are kind of weird, fringe topics. So I think bad advice would be trying to kind of go with the flow a little bit more, kind of like follow the stream of what people are already doing. Chase money a little bit more, where if you follow what you're interested in, eventually all of the things that you want will be a product of that.
Okay. So what are some projects that you're currently working on, and how can people kind of reach out to you and follow the journey?
So right now the big project I'm working on, I just finished up concurrent training presentation. So right now the big thing that I'm interested in is looking at a lot of the infrared thermography research and trying to understand how that fits into my worldview and everything that I'm doing with NIRS. But for people who are interested in seeing what I'm up to and the different concepts that I'm thinking about, the best place to find me is probably on Instagram is the platform I use the most. And then we have an education platform that we do at Training Think Tank, where we put out a lot of the things that we're thinking about.
Okay, and then how would they just go to trainingthinktank.com, or what is the handle there?
So if they go to trainingthinktank.com, it's called the TTT Classroom, and that's our educational line. So we have a program design section, art of coaching, and then sports science, and we just put out the different coaching concepts that we use with our clients here, as well as what we're thinking about or doing from a sports science standpoint, and just trying to continually put content in there every week.
Okay, fantastic. And then you're active on social media, correct? What is that handle?
Instagram's the main platform I use. I try and put a lot of content on there. It's Evan, EVAN_PEIKON.
Fantastic. Well, Coach, this has been great. Thank you so much for taking the time out. It's been, very eye-opening. A lot of things that, people kind of comb over and dive into the research about, and maybe, start to integrate in their practice. So once again, thank you for your time, and hopefully we can connect again soon in the future.
Of course, man. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.